The rain poured down on the luxurious streets of Manhattan as Ethan Kensington stepped out of his black Ferrari. Another successful business deal had just made him even richer. At 42, he had everything money could buy, a mansion in the Quay, most exclusive part of the city, a fleet of expensive cars and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But something was missing, and he knew it. He was about to hurry into Le Cirque, one of the city's most expensive restaurants, when he saw them. A woman and a small boy huddled under a bus stop, trying to stay dry. The woman held the child close, her torn coat wrapped around both of them. Most days, Ethan would have walked right past them. He had seen hundreds of homeless people before, and never stopped. But something made him pause this time. Maybe it was the way the little boy clutched his mother, or maybe it was the quiet dignity in the woman's eyes despite her situation. Whatever it was, Ethan found himself walking toward them instead of the restaurant. "Do you need help?" he asked, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. The woman looked up, and even through the dirt on her face, Ethan could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 30s. Her eyes were a striking green, filled with a mix of pride and desperation. "We'll be fine," she said softly, pulling her son closer. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. He was thin, too thin, and shivering despite his mother's attempts to keep him warm. "No, you won't," Ethan said firmly. "Not in this weather. Come with me." The woman hesitated, fear crossing her face. "I don't know." Ethan knelt down, not caring that his $5,000 suit was getting wet. He looked directly at the little boy, whose big brown eyes reminded him of his own childhood. "Photos. Hey buddy, what's your name?" The boy peeked out from his mother's embrace. "Tommy," he whispered. "Well, Tommy, I'm Ethan. Would you and your mum like to get somewhere warm and dry? I have a big house with plenty of food." Tommy looked up at his mother hopefully. She still seemed uncertain, and Ethan understood why. A strange man offering help could be dangerous. "Look," he said, pulling out his wallet and showing her his ID. "I'm Ethan Kensington. You've probably seen my company's name on buildings around the city. I promise you'll be safe. You can leave anytime you want, but please let me help you tonight." The woman studied his face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly. "Sarah Mitchell." Ethan helped them into his car, noticing how few possessions they had, just one small backpack between them. His driver, James, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had worked for Ethan long enough to know not to question his boss's decisions. The drive to his mansion was quiet. Tommy had fallen asleep almost immediately, the warmth of the car and the gentle motion lulling him into exhaustion. Sarah sat, rigidly, her arms still protectively around her son. "How long have you been on the streets?" Ethan asked gently. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. 3 months. I lost my job when the restaurant I worked at closed down. Couldn't make rent. We stayed with friends for a while, but..." She trailed off, and Ethan could see the shame in her eyes. "Life happens," he said simply. "Sometimes we all need help." When they arrived at his mansion, Sarah's eyes widened. The house was enormous, with perfectly manicured gardens and a fountain in the front. Security cameras monitored every angle, and a tall iron gate protected the entrance. Mrs. Rodriguez, his housekeeper, was waiting at the door. Ethan had called ahead, asking her to prepare rooms and some food. The elderly woman took one look at Sarah and Tommy and immediately went into mother hen mode. Come, she said warmly. "Let's get you both cleaned up and fed. I've run a hot bath and found some clean clothes that should fit." Sarah looked overwhelmed by the kindness, tears filling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you both." As Mrs. Rodriguez led them upstairs, Ethan watched them go. He told himself this was just for one night. He'd give them some money. In the morning, maybe help Sarah find a job, and that would be it. He had a business empire to run. He couldn't get involved in charity cases. But something about Sarah's quiet strength and Tommy's innocent trust had touched something in him. Something he thought he'd buried long ago, when he was climbing his way out of his own poverty, determined never to need anyone's help again. Little did he know, this rainy night would change everything. The woman he thought he was saving would end up saving him in ways he never expected. But first, there would be challenges, revelations, and a journey that would teach them both about trust, love, and the true meaning of wealth. Sarah woke up, in a bed softer than anything she'd ever felt before. For a moment she was confused, thinking it must be a dream, but then she remembered the rain, the kind stranger, this magnificent house. She sat up quickly, checking the other side of the bed where Tommy had fallen asleep next to her. He was still there, peaceful and warm, looking so different after a hot bath and clean pajamas. Mrs. Rodriguez had even found some children's clothes in the attic, probably left over from when Ethan's business partners visited with their kids. A gentle knock on the door made her jump. "Come in," she called softly, not wanting to wake Tommy. Mrs. Rodriguez entered with a warm smile and a tray of breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee and pancakes made Sarah's stomach growl. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper said. "I thought you might be hungry. Mr. Kensington asked me to tell you he'd like to speak with you when you're ready. No rush. He's in his home office all morning." Sarah nodded, suddenly nervous. What did he want to talk about? Would he ask them to leave right away? She wouldn't blame him. They were strangers after all, after breakfast and getting dressed in the simple but elegant clothes Mrs. Rodriguez had provided. Sarah found her way to Ethan's office. Tommy was happily watching cartoons in the family room, already comfortable in this new environment, in the way only children can be. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," Ethan called. He was sitting behind a massive desk, looking through some papers. When he looked up, he froze. Sarah felt self-conscious under his stare, but she couldn't know what he was thinking. Ethan couldn't believe this was the same woman from last night. Clean and properly dressed, Sarah was stunning. Her long dark hair fell in soft waves around her face, and without the dirt and exhaustion, her green eyes sparkled. The simple blue dress Mrs. Rodriguez had found fit her perfectly. "Please sit down," he said, finally finding his voice. Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "I want to help you," Ethan said directly. "Not just for a night or two. I have a proposal for you." Sarah tensed slightly but waited for him to continue. "I need a live-in assistant," he explained. "Someone to help manage the house, coordinate with staff, handle some basic correspondence. Mrs. Rodriguez is getting older and could use the help. The position comes with room and board, plus a salary. Tommy would have his own room, and there's a good school nearby." Sarah's eyes widened. "Mr. Kensington, Please call me Ethan." "Ethan," she said softly, "why would you do this? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." He smiled. "I'm a good judge of character. It's how I built my business. And something tells me you're exactly who you appear to be, a good person who's had some bad luck." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," Ethan said firmly. "It's a job offer. You'll work hard for everything you get here. The question is, are you willing to take the chance?" Sarah thought about Tommy, about the way his eyes lit up this morning when he woke up in a real bed, about the possibility of giving him a stable home and education. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll take the job." What Sarah didn't know was that across town, in a luxurious penthouse apartment, someone else was very interested in Ethan Kensington. Victoria Sinclair, socialite and daughter of Ethan's biggest business rival, had set her sights on him months ago. Victoria was used to getting what she wanted, and what she wanted now was to merge her father's company with Ethan's through marriage. She had been carefully plotting her way into his life, showing up at the same charity events, befriending his sister, making sure she was seen as the perfect match for New York's most eligible bachelor. When her phone rang that morning, it was one of her many sources calling with interesting news. "Miss Sinclair, you might want to know that Mr. Kensington brought someone home last night. A woman and a child," Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palm. "Tell me everything." As the source shared what little they knew, Victoria's blue eyes narrowed. This wouldn't do at all. She had worked too hard to let some random woman ruin her plans. "Keep watching," she ordered. "I want to know everything about this woman, where she came from, what she's doing there, everything." Back at the mansion, Sarah was getting a tour of the house from Mrs. Rodriguez, learning about her new duties. Tommy trailed behind them, amazed by everything he saw. "Mama, look at the fish," he exclaimed, pressing his face against the glass of a huge aquarium in the living room. Sarah smiled, watching her son's excitement. For the first time in months, she felt hope. But she also felt something else, something that made her nervous. She had seen the way Ethan looked at her in his office. And worse, she had felt something too, a flutter in her stomach, a warmth, so in her chest. But she couldn't think about that. He was her employer now, and she couldn't risk this opportunity by developing inappropriate feelings. What she didn't know was that Ethan was watching her from the doorway of his office, unable to concentrate on his work. The way she smiled at her son, the graceful way she moved, the intelligence in her eyes as she quickly grasped everything Mrs. Rodriguez explained. It all fascinated him. "This is just business," he muttered to himself, turning back to his desk. Just helping someone in need, but deep down he knew he was lying to himself. And soon, very soon, both their lives would become more complicated than either of them could imagine. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah and Tommy moved into the Kensington mansion. The changes in their lives were like something out of a dream. Tommy was enrolled in the nearby private school, wearing a crisp new uniform and making friends for the first time in months. Sarah threw herself into her new duties, learning quickly and earning Mrs. Rodriguez's approval. But trouble was brewing. Victoria Sinclair sat in her father's office at Sinclair Industries, reviewing the background check she'd ordered on Sarah Mitchell. "So she's nobody," Victoria said, flipping through the pages. "Worked as a waitress, husband died in a car crash 3 years ago, no family to speak of. Perfect." Her father, Richard Sinclair, frowned at his daughter. "Victoria, what are you planning?" "Daddy, you know we need this merger with Kensington Enterprises. Our company won't survive another year without it. And Ethan Kensington is the key." She stood up, smoothing her designer dress. "I won't let some charity case ruin everything we've worked for." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Sarah was organizing Ethan's schedule for the week when he walked into the office. She tried to ignore the way her heart skipped a beat when he smiled at her. "How's Tommy liking his new school?" Ethan asked, leaning against his desk. Sarah's face lit up. "He loves it. His teacher says he's catching up quickly." "I can't thank you enough for—" "Stop thanking me," Ethan interrupted gently. "You've more than earned everything. This place runs better than ever with you here." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. The attraction between them was growing stronger every day, but both were fighting it for different reasons. The moment was broken by Mrs. Rodriguez rushing in. "Mr. Kensington, Miss Sinclair is here to see you." Before Ethan could respond, Victoria swept into the office like she owned it. She was dressed to kill in a red designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled. "Ethan, darling." She air-kissed his cheek, then turned to Sarah with a cold smile. "And you must be the new help I've heard so much about." Sarah felt her face flush. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Mr. Kensington's assistant." "How quaint," Victoria purred. "Ethan, we simply must discuss the charity gala next week. The press is expecting us to arrive together." Ethan looked uncomfortable. "Victoria, I don't remember agreeing to—" "Don't be silly, darling. Everyone knows we're perfect for each other. Now, about my dress?" Sarah quietly slipped out of the office, her heart heavy. Of course, someone like Victoria would be in Ethan's life. They made sense together, both from the same world of wealth and privilege. That evening, Sarah was helping Tommy with his homework in the kitchen when Mrs. Rodriguez joined them, her face worried. "That woman," the housekeeper muttered, starting to prepare dinner. "She's been trying to sink her claws into Mr. Kensington for months, but he's never been interested." "It's none of my business," Sarah said quickly. "Mrs. Rodriguez gave her a knowing look. "Maybe it should be. I've worked for Mr. Kensington for 15 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Before Sarah could respond, Tommy piped up. "I like Mr. Ethan. He plays baseball with me in the garden and helps me with my math." Sarah's heart melted at the thought. Ethan had been so kind to Tommy, treating him not like a charity case but like a regular kid who needed a friend. Upstairs in his office, Ethan was having a heated conversation with Victoria. "I don't appreciate you showing up unannounced," he said firmly. "And I definitely don't appreciate you being rude to my staff." Victoria's sweet facade dropped. "Staff?" Is that what we're calling her? The whole city is talking, Ethan, about how you took in some homeless woman and her brat. Ethan's face hardened. Get out. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out of my house. And don't come back. If you ever speak about Sarah or Tommy like that again, you'll regret it. Victoria's eyes flashed with anger. You're making a big mistake, Ethan. Your father's company is failing. That's why you're really here, isn't it? You thought you could manipulate me into a merger through marriage. He laughed coldly. I'm not that easy to fool, Victoria. After she stormed out, Ethan stood at his window, watching the sun set over the city. He could hear Tommy's laughter floating up from the kitchen, mixed with Sarah's voice and Mrs. Rodriguez's warm chuckle. The sound made him smile, but it also scared him. He was falling in love, not just with Sarah, but with the idea of a family, of coming home to laughter and warmth instead of an empty mansion. But Victoria's visit had reminded him of the cruel world they lived in. How would Sarah handle the pressure of his world? The media attention, the business sharks, the society vultures, and more importantly, how could he be sure she had real feelings for him? Would she ever be able to forget that he was her employer, that he had found her homeless and desperate? In the kitchen, Sarah was having similar thoughts. She watched Tommy, chatting happily with Mrs. Rodriguez, her heart full of love and fear. She was falling for Ethan, but she couldn't risk Tommy's security. If things went wrong, they could end up back on the streets. Neither of them knew that across town Victoria was already plotting her revenge. She picked up her phone and dialed. Daddy, I need you to find out everything about Sarah Mitchell's past, every detail, every secret. Everyone has something to hide, and when we find hers, Ethan Kensington will be sorry he ever chose her over me. The sun finished setting over New York City, casting long shadows through the mansion's windows. In the warm kitchen, a makeshift family enjoyed dinner together, while dark clouds of trouble gathered on the horizon. The peace they had found was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. Victoria's private investigator sat across from her in a dimly lit restaurant, sliding a thick folder across the table. Her red lips curved into a smile as she opened it. Well, well, she murmured. Sarah Mitchell isn't exactly who she claims to be. The investigator nodded. Her real name is Sarah Collins. She changed it after her husband died. But that's not the interesting part. Look at page 3. Victoria's eyes widened as she read. Oh, this is perfect. Absolutely perfect. Meanwhile, at the Kensington mansion, Sarah was having the best morning of her life. Tommy had gotten an A on his math test, and Ethan had suggested they celebrate with a picnic in the garden. Now she watched as her son and Ethan played catch, their laughter echoing across the perfectly manicured lawn. He's a natural, Ethan said, jogging over to where Sarah sat on the blanket. We should sign him up for Little League. Sarah's heart swelled. You've already done so much. For us, Sarah. Ethan sat down beside her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. When will you understand? I do these things because I want to, not because I have to. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt that familiar flutter in her stomach. Ethan reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Mama, look! Tommy's shout broke the moment. He was attempting to juggle 3 baseballs, failing spectacularly but laughing anyway. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the garden door. Mr. Kensington, there's an urgent call from the office. Ethan sighed, standing reluctantly. I'll be right there. He looked down at Sarah. Have dinner with me tonight? Just us? Mrs. Rodriguez already offered to watch Tommy. Sarah's heart raced. Yes, I'd like that. Inside his office, Ethan's good mood vanished as soon as he heard what his secretary had to say. Sir Richard Sinclair is trying to buy up controlling shares of Kensington Enterprises through shell companies. We caught it just in time, but what? He's calling for an emergency board meeting. Says he has information that could damage the company's reputation. Ethan's jaw clenched. He should have known Victoria wouldn't give up easily. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her closet, nervous about her dinner with Ethan. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, holding a beautiful blue dress. This was Mrs. Kensington's, the housekeeper said softly. Ethan's mother. I think she would have wanted you to have it. Sarah touched the silky fabric. I couldn't possibly... Yes, you can. That boy hasn't smiled like he does now since his parents died. You and Tommy brought life back to this house. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as Mrs. Rodriguez helped her into the dress. It fit perfectly, as if it was meant for her. When she walked down the grand staircase, Ethan was waiting at the bottom. He stared at her, speechless. You look beautiful, he finally managed. The restaurant was the most elegant place Sarah had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as Ethan pulled out her chair. I need to tell you something, they both said at the same time, then laughed. You first, Ethan said. Sarah took a deep breath. My real name is Sarah Collins. I changed it after my husband died. I should have told you sooner. Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand. I know. I had you checked out when you first came to work for me. Standard procedure for all employees. You knew and you didn't say anything? It wasn't my secret to tell. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Sarah felt tears threatening again. There's more. The night of the accident that killed my husband, I was driving. It was raining just like the night you found us. We were arguing about money, about moving to a cheaper apartment. I was distracted. The truck came out of nowhere. Oh, Sarah. Ethan squeezed her hand. After that, I couldn't stay there. Couldn't face our friends, our neighbors. Everyone knew it was my fault. So I changed our names, moved to New York, started over. But I couldn't outrun my guilt. When we ended up on the streets, a part of me felt like I deserved it. Listen to me, Ethan said firmly. It was an accident. You're an amazing mother who has done everything possible to give your son a good life. That's what matters. Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but acceptance and something else. Something that made her heart race. Now it's my turn, Ethan said. I'm in love with you. Sarah's breath caught. I've been fighting it because you work for me. Because I was afraid you might feel obligated. But I can't fight it anymore. These past weeks with you and Tommy, you've made this house a home again. You've made me want things I never thought I would. Ethan, but before she could respond, his phone buzzed. The color drained from his face as he read the message. What's wrong? Victoria, she's going to the press with your story. Not just about the accident, but about changing your name, about being homeless. She's spinning it like you're a con artist who manipulated your way into my life. Sarah felt sick. Oh God. Tommy, the kids at school. I won't let her hurt you, Ethan said fiercely. Either of you. But Sarah, I need to know. Do you have feelings for me? Real feelings, not gratitude. Sarah stood, up walking around the table to him. In front of the entire restaurant, she cupped his face in her hands and kissed him. I love you too, she whispered. I have for weeks. Ethan pulled her close, not caring who saw. But even as they held each other, they knew the real battle was just beginning. Victoria wouldn't give up easily, and the media storm that was coming would test their love in ways they couldn't imagine. In her penthouse apartment, Victoria watched the restaurant's security feed on her laptop, her face twisted with rage as she saw Sarah and Ethan kiss. Enjoy it while you can, she snarled, picking up her phone, because tomorrow your perfect little world comes crashing down. The next morning, Sarah's face was splashed across every tabloid in New York. Homeless con artist seduces billionaire. The headline screamed, Deadly past of Kensington's new love. Tommy came running into the kitchen, tears streaming down his face. Mama, the kids at school are saying mean things. They're saying you killed Dad. Sarah pulled her son into her arms, her heart breaking. Mrs. Rodriguez quickly turned off the TV where a news anchor was discussing the scandal. We're not going to school today, sweetheart, Sarah said softly. We're going to pack our things and you're not going anywhere. Ethan's voice was firm as he walked into the kitchen. He knelt down in front of Tommy. Hey, buddy, those kids at school don't know what they're talking about. Your mom is the bravest, strongest person I know, and we're going to fight this together, okay? Tommy wiped his eyes. You promise? I promise. Ethan looked up at Sarah. Both of you are staying. Right here where you belong. But Sarah shook her head. I can't let you destroy your reputation for us, your company. My company will be fine, Ethan interrupted. I just got off the phone with my lawyers. We're suing every newspaper that printed those stories. And Victoria. His eyes hardened. She's going to regret this. Just then, Richard Sinclair walked into the kitchen, followed by Victoria, who wore a triumphant smile. "How did you get in here?" Ethan demanded. "Your security let us in. After all, I'm a major shareholder now." Richard smiled coldly. "The board meeting is in an hour, Ethan. They're voting on whether to remove you as CEO. A scandal like this, well, our investors are very concerned." "Get out of my house," Ethan growled. "Your house?" Victoria laughed. "When the board kicks you out, it'll be company property, and then—" She looked at Sarah with contempt. "Then you and your little brat can go back to where you belong, the streets." Tommy started crying again, and something in Sarah snapped. She walked right up to Victoria, her green eyes blazing. "You can say what you want about me, but don't you dare threaten my son." Victoria smirked. "Or what? Face it, honey. You're nothing but a gold digger who got caught." What happened next shocked everyone. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her phone held high. "I recorded everything," the housekeeper said. "You threatening a child, admitting to buying shares to take over the company. I wonder what the press would think about that." Victoria's face went white. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Mrs. Rodriguez said fiercely. "I've watched you chase Mr. Ethan for months, acting like you're better than everyone. But you're just a spoiled brat who's never worked for anything in her life." Richard grabbed his daughter's arm. "Victoria, that's enough. We're leaving." "This isn't over," Victoria hissed. After they left, Sarah turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Thank you." The housekeeper hugged her. "Nobody threatens my family." Ethan looked at his watch. "I have to go to that board meeting, Sarah." "Go," she said. "Fight for your company. We'll be here when you get back." The next few hours were the longest of Sarah's life. She tried to keep Tommy distracted with games and stories, but her mind kept going to Ethan. What was happening in that meeting? Finally, as the sun was setting, they heard his car pull up. Sarah's heart stopped when she saw his face. He looked exhausted. "What happened?" she asked. A slow smile spread across his face. "We won." Mrs. Rodriguez's video was the key. When the board saw how Victoria and her father really operated, they voted to block their takeover attempt, and Madhi pulled out his phone, showing them a news website. "Look," the headline read, "Sinclair Scandal Attempted Hostile Takeover Exposed." Tommy jumped up and down. "Does this mean we can stay?" Actually, Ethan knelt down to the boy's level. "I was hoping you and your mom might want to do more than just stay." Sarah's breath caught as Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know it's fast," he said, looking up at her. "But when you know, you know. Sarah Collins Mitchell, will you marry me?" Tears rolled down Sarah's face. "Are you sure? After everything, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You and Tommy, you're my family now if you'll have me." Tommy bounced with excitement. "Say yes, Mama." Sarah laughed through her tears. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." As Ethan slipped the ring on her finger and pulled her into a kiss, Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes and hugged Tommy. But across town, Victoria sat in her dark apartment, drinking straight from a wine bottle. Her phone buzzed with another news alert about the scandal. Her father had already fled the country, leaving her to face the mess alone. "They think this is over," she slurred, picking up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Mark Collins. "Hello?" a male voice answered. "Mr. Collins? This is Victoria Sinclair. I believe we have something in common. Sarah Mitchell. Or should I say your dead brother's wife?" The line was quiet for a moment. "I'm listening," Victoria smiled wickedly. "How would you like to help me destroy the woman who killed your brother?" Back at the mansion, Sarah, Ethan, and Tommy sat in the garden planning their future, unaware that their greatest challenge was still to come. Sometimes the ghosts of the past refused to stay buried, and Sarah's past was about to come back to haunt her in ways she never imagined. News of Ethan and Sarah's engagement spread quickly through New York's high society. Most newspapers had dropped Victoria's scandal in favor of the more romantic story of the billionaire and the woman he'd rescued from the streets. People loved a good fairy tale. Sarah sat in the mansion's living room, surrounded by wedding magazines that Mrs. Rodriguez had bought. Tommy was at school. Things had calmed down after Ethan had a stern talk with the principal about bullying. The blue roses would be nice for the centerpieces, Mrs. Rodriguez suggested, but Sarah seemed distracted. "Sarah?" the housekeeper asked, gently. "What's wrong?" "It doesn't feel real," Sarah admitted. "Like I'm going to wake up back under that bus stop with Tommy." Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed her hand. "It's real, dear. You deserve this happiness." Just then, the doorbell rang. When the security guard opened the door, a tall man with dark hair walked in. Sarah's face went white. "Mark?" Mark Collins, her late husband's brother, stood in the entrance hall. He looked exactly like she remembered. The same eyes as Tommy's, the same stern expression he'd worn at the funeral. "Hello, Sarah," he said coldly. "Or should I call you Mrs. Kensington to be?" Sarah stood up shakily. "What are you doing here?" "Can't I visit my nephew, my only connection to my dead brother?" His voice was bitter. "The brother you killed." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward. "I'm calling Mr. Kensington." "No," Sarah said quickly. "It's okay." "Mark, let's talk in the garden." Outside, the sunny day seemed to mock the tension between them. Mark looked around at the luxury with disgust. "You certainly landed on your feet, didn't you? While my brother rots in the ground, you're living in a mansion, engaged to a billionaire." "It wasn't like that," Sarah protested. "I never planned—" "Save it," Mark snapped. "I'm here about Tommy. He belongs with family, not some rich stranger who's trying to play daddy." Sarah's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm filing for custody. Tommy should be with his father's family, not the woman who killed him." "You can't do this," Sarah's voice shook. "Tommy is happy here. He's in a good school, he has friends. He has blood relatives who love him," Mark interrupted, "who won't lie to him about his past. Do you think he'll still love you when he learns the truth about that night?" "The truth?" Ethan's voice made them both turn. He stood there, his face hard with anger. "The truth is that Sarah has spent every day since the accident putting Tommy first." "Where were you, Mark? When they were homeless, when Tommy was hungry?" Mark's face reddened. "You don't know anything about our family." "I know enough," Ethan said. "I know you never offered to help them. I know you're only here now because Victoria Sinclair contacted you." Mark looked surprised, then tried to cover it. "That's not—" "My security team is very thorough," Ethan continued. "They tracked your phone calls, your meetings. How much did she offer you? To try to take Tommy away?" Sarah gasped. "You're working with Victoria?" "She opened my eyes," Mark shouted. "Made me see how wrong it was to let you get away with what you did." "Get out," Ethan said quietly. "Now. And if you try to take Tommy, I'll bury you in so many lawsuits you'll never see the inside of a courtroom." After Mark stormed out, Sarah collapsed into Ethan's arms, sobbing. "He's right," she cried. "Tommy deserves to know the truth about everything." "Then we'll tell him," Ethan said gently. "Together. He's old enough to understand about accidents, about guilt and forgiveness." That evening, they sat Tommy down in the family room. Sarah held her son's hands as she told him everything about the night his father died. About the argument, the rain, the truck she didn't see in time. Tommy was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he threw his arms around her neck. "It's okay, Mama," he whispered. "Dad would forgive you and I love you." Sarah held him tight, tears streaming down her face. Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them, but their peace was short-lived. The next morning, papers were delivered to the mansion. Mark had filed for emergency custody, claiming Sarah was an unfit mother who had endangered Tommy before and was doing it again by exposing him to media attention. "He can't win," Ethan assured her. "I have the best lawyers in the country." "But the publicity," Sarah worried. "The custody battle will be all over the news. It'll hurt Tommy all over again." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Then maybe it's time to fight fire with fire." They all looked at her. "That Victoria woman thinks she's so clever, using Mark to do her dirty work. But two can play at that game." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you're a genius. Sarah, how would you feel about giving an exclusive interview? Tell your side of the story, all of it. The accident, the guilt, the struggles, and how love helped you heal." Sarah hesitated. "You think people would understand?" "They'll relate." "To you," Mrs. Rodriguez said. A mother's love, redemption, forgiveness, these are things everyone understands. As they planned their counterattack, none of them noticed Tommy standing in the doorway, his small face set with determination. He had his own plan to help his mother. That night, he snuck into Ethan's office and used the computer to send an email to every news station in the city. His message was simple but powerful. "My name is Tommy Mitchell. You're all talking about my mom, but nobody asked me what I think. She's the best mom in the world. She kept me safe when we had nothing. And now we have a new dad who loves us. Please don't let my uncle take me away from my family." The email would reach the media by morning, changing everything once again. But in the dark halls of her penthouse, Victoria was already plotting her next move. And this time, she had something even more devastating planned. Something that would shake Sarah and Ethan's love to its very foundation. Tommy's email changed everything. Every news channel in New York picked up the story. Pictures of the little boy's face were everywhere, along with his heartfelt plea to stay with his mother. Public opinion, which had been mixed before, swung dramatically in Sarah's favor. "Look at these comments," Mrs. Rodriguez said, scrolling through her phone. "Everyone's supporting you now." Sarah read some of the social media posts through tears. "Leave this family alone. They've been through enough. That little boy knows who really loves him. Some accidents can't be fixed, but love can heal anything." But Victoria Sinclair wasn't finished. She sat in a dark booth at an expensive restaurant, meeting with a man who looked nervous to be there. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "If anyone finds out I gave you these," Victoria smiled coldly, pulling out hospital records. "No one will know, doctor, but these prove what I suspected. Sarah's big secret, the one even she doesn't know about." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Ethan was meeting with his lawyers while Sarah helped Tommy with his homework. "The custody hearing is next week," one lawyer explained. "But honestly, Mr. Kensington, I don't think Mark Collins has a case. The judge will see this for what it is, harassment." Ethan nodded, but something was bothering him. "It's too easy. Victoria never gives up this quickly. She must have something else planned." As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. It was a photo of a medical report with a note from Victoria. "Poor Sarah. She doesn't even know she was pregnant when she had that accident. When she killed not just her husband, but their unborn child too. Wonder what Tommy will think of his mother now." Ethan's hands shook with rage. He wanted to protect Sarah from this new cruelty, but he knew keeping secrets would only make things worse. He found her in the garden, watching Tommy play with his new puppy, a gift from Ethan they'd named Hope. "Sarah," he said gently, "we need to talk." When he showed her the message and the medical report, Sarah's face went white. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible. I would have known." "The report says you were only 6 weeks along," Ethan explained softly. "You might not have realized." Sarah stumbled to a nearby bench, her whole body shaking. "2 lives," she sobbed. "I took 2 lives that night. Tommy will never forgive me. He always wanted a little brother or sister." "Mama." Tommy's voice made them both turn. He stood there with Hope, his face worried. "Why are you crying?" Sarah tried to wipe her tears, but Tommy was already climbing into her lap. "What's wrong? Did Aunt Victoria do something mean again?" The simple question, asked with such innocent concern, broke something in Sarah. She held her son tight and told him everything, about the baby he might have had, about how sorry she was. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then said something that showed wisdom beyond his years. "But Mama, it was an accident. And now we have Ethan and Hope and Mrs. Rodriguez. They're our family too." Ethan knelt beside them, pulling them both into his arms. "He's right, Sarah. Family isn't just about blood. It's about love." But their moment of peace was interrupted by Mrs. Rodriguez rushing out with her phone. "You need to see this," she said urgently. Victoria was on every news channel, giving a tearful interview. "I only wanted to protect my dear friend Ethan," she was saying. "When I discovered that Sarah had not only caused her husband's death, but also lost their unborn child due to her reckless driving, well, I couldn't stay silent. Poor little Tommy deserves to be with his father's family. away from the woman who destroyed so many lives. The reporters were eating it up, calling it a shocking new development in the custody case. Tommy surprised them all by grabbing the phone and starting to type. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Sarah asked. "Telling the truth again," he said, firmly. "That mean lady doesn't get to make my mama cry." His new message went viral even faster than the first one. "My mama didn't destroy our family. She kept us together. She read me stories when we had no home. She hugged me when I was scared. And now we have a bigger family with more love. Stop being mean to her. She's the bravest person I know." The response was immediate. Stand With Sarah started trending. People began sharing their own stories of accidents, forgiveness, and second chances. Even Mark Collins was affected. Seeing his nephew defend his mother so fiercely made him question what he was doing. Victoria's influence began to fade as he remembered how his brother had always said Sarah was the best thing that ever happened to him. But Victoria had one last card to play. In her penthouse, she made a call to someone who could destroy not just Sarah, but Ethan too. "Hello, Margaret," she purred into the phone. "How would you like to get revenge on your son? You know Ethan, the one who threw you out of the family company 5 years ago." On the other end, Ethan's mother, who nobody had seen since the scandal that almost destroyed Kensington Enterprises, smiled wickedly. "Tell me more, dear." The sun set over New York City, casting long shadows through the mansion's windows. In the garden, Sarah, Ethan, and Tommy sat together, their love stronger, for having weathered another storm. But the biggest test of all was about to begin, as a woman who knew all of Ethan's darkest secrets prepared to return home.